Good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a good Thursday so far. We've had quite a week this week looking at the Cold War in the 1940s, 1950s, and today the 1960s. Some of the things that we've looked at already this week are just continuing, like the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War continued throughout the decade. Matter of fact, the Vietnam War was escalating. The involvement of the United States, the involvement of China, the involvement of the Soviet Union was increasing. It was still not a direct war, but it was still a proxy war. But the investment each country was making in the war was increasing as the United States was determined that communism wouldn't spread, and the Soviet Union and China were determined that communism would spread. Another thing that was continuing in the 1960s was the arms race. The arms race was continuing with the development of new sophisticated weapons. Also continuing was the nuclear arms race. The building of nuclear missiles, the building of new nuclear weapons, more powerful nuclear weapons, was continuing. Another item, or another area of the Cold War that was continuing was the space race. The space race was continuing. The space race was developing now in the 1960s into who could get to the moon first, who could land on the moon first, who could put a person in space first. Soviet Union was the first country to put a person into space. The United States was the first country to be able to put a person on the moon. So the space race continues throughout the 1960s into the 1970s. There's a new event that took place in the 1960s that I want you to be aware of. In the middle 1950s, Cuba's leader was overthrown. Cuba's leader was overthrown with the assistance of the United States. A man named Fidel Castro became the leader of Cuba. Shortly after becoming the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro announced that he was a communist. An embarrassment to the United States, knowing that we helped a communist become leader of an island just 60 miles away from the United States. Remember the idea of the domino theory? Were we worried so much about communism coming to the United States? No, but we were worried about communism spreading to the nations of Central America and South America. That led the United States' CIA to organize an invasion of Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion was sponsored by the United States. However, who was involved in it was Cuban refugees, people of Cuba that had left after Castro had come into power. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a failure. It was a complete failure. But that led the way for the Soviet Union to have an excuse to defend Cuba. So the Soviet Union began to put nuclear missile sites in Cuba. The Soviet Union said they were for defensive missiles. We believe that they were for nuclear missiles. But that led in 1963 to what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was probably the closest the United States ever came to fighting directly with the Soviet Union. It was about 2 weeks of tension, high tension between the two countries. We surrounded Cuba with our Navy, and any ship coming into Cuba was stopped. Eventually, the crisis came to an end with several things. One, we promised we would never invade Cuba again. We also promised that we would remove our missiles from Turkey. We were upset with the Soviet Union for having missiles so close to us, and yet we had an outdated missile system in Turkey right next to the Soviet Union. And by this point, the idea of having to have like missile sites is becoming less significant because of one thing we haven't looked at yet, and that was the development of nuclear submarines that could spend months submerged under the ocean carrying nuclear weapons. I wish we had more time to look at the 1960s, but we don't. Don't forget that tomorrow we have a test over the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the Cold War. For the rest of the time period and going into tomorrow, we're going to look at a video about the Vietnam War. I think you'll find it really good. It focuses on the Vietnam War from an American perspective. So tomorrow we have a test, and then we'll continue our look at the Cold War. Any homework you have, make sure you put on the left-hand side of my desk, and I hope you have a great day.